Look, we're skipping the usual pleasantries today because, as policymakers, you need to understand the immediate, quantified stakes of our current reality right now. Our gross national debt just hit $38.94 trillion. And honestly, this staggering number is colliding head on with an era of unprecedented institutional distrust. What we're covering in this explainer isn't speculation, it's grounded strictly in recent socioeconomic data, global trust barometers, and historical modeling of great powers.
Okay, let's dive right into this executive briefing, a threat assessment of the compounding structural crises facing the American Republic. It's absolutely crucial that we view these not as isolated incidents, but as interconnected crises. We'll be looking at how deep societal fractures, fiscal unsustainability, and historical patterns of democratic decay are fundamentally altering America's position on the global stage. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover 5 key areas. First, an executive summary on systemic threats. Second, the rise of insularity. Third, debt and economic fragility. Fourth, echoes of fallen republics. And finally, we'll wrap up with the hegemonic inflection point. All right, let's get into part 1, executive summary on systemic threats. Take a look at the sheer scale of democratic backsliding in the United States over the last 2 decades. It is stark. Look at the varieties of democracy, or VDEM index, dropping from 0.81 down to 0.57. Actually, scratch that. Just look at the broader consensus. Global intelligence units, including the Economist Intelligence Unit, have officially downgraded the U.S. to a flawed democracy. What's really vital to grasp here is that this deterioration is happening at a speed that is highly unusual for a developed nation, heavily driven by multi-year rises in threats and reprisals for political expression. Moving right along to part 2. The rise of insularity. You know, laws and policies don't just exist in a vacuum, right? They exist within a societal framework that is currently undergoing a profound psychological shift. We've essentially transitioned from a crisis of grievance into a crisis of insularity. Grievance still implies a demand for the system to change. Insularity, on the other hand, is a complete retreat from the system. It's a fundamental shift in the collective mentality from we to me, where individuals are just abandoning the dialogue and compromise that a republic actually requires to function. And the numbers on this are honestly pretty alarming. According to the 2026 Edelman Trust Barometer, a staggering 70% of Americans now view political opponents as existential enemies rather than legitimate opposition. Think about that for a second. 7 in 10 respondents are unwilling or at least deeply hesitant to trust someone simply because they hold different values or rely on different facts. This creates a deeply fractured public square where policy consensus becomes practically impossible. Furthermore, this distrust isn't evenly distributed across the board. The U.S. now leads the entire world with a massive 29-point mass class divide. Basically, this means lower-income individuals view our institutions as highly incompetent and unethical, while high-income earners generally still trust those same systems. When the working class broadly believes the system is fundamentally rigged against them, institutional legitimacy just collapses. Now, add the information crisis to the mix, and it acts as a literal threat multiplier to this insularity. Researchers analyzing the 2024 elections documented the massive impact of what they call inorganic discourse. Malicious actors are deploying AI sleeper bots, sophisticated language models that lie dormant until they're strategically activated to manipulate opaque social media algorithms. They're manufacturing an artificial sense of consensus, drowning out authentic human voices, and weaponizing the very algorithms designed to keep us enraged and engaged. Okay, part 3, debt and economic fragility. So layer all those societal fractures we just talked about on top of an increasingly precarious fiscal foundation. It honestly mirrors classic imperial overstretch. Our debt recently exceeded 100% of GDP, and thanks to rising interest rates, net interest now eats up roughly 14% of all federal outlays. This means the sheer cost of maintaining global leadership, combined with paying rising interest costs, is beginning to exceed the nation's material capacity. For you as policymakers, this severely limits your flexibility to invest in the digital and energy infrastructure we need to stay competitive globally. To really understand the domestic impact of this economy, analysts are comparing our current environment directly to the late 19th century Gilded Age. Today, the top 1% owns over 30% of the national wealth, and massive tech titans wield monopolistic power over our digital infrastructure, much like the railroad and steel barons of the 1890s. History repeatedly shows us that this kind of extreme wealth concentration, paired with rapid technological disruption, fuels deep and lasting populist resentment. Which brings us to part 4, echoes of fallen republics.
Political scientists are increasingly warning that America might be facing a Weimar moment. Now, this isn't about perfectly equating eras. It's a structural comparison to 1930s Germany. It describes a fragile state where the democratic superstructure technically still exists, but it's paralyzed. Severe economic precarity creates a societal yearning for strongman leadership, someone who bypasses empirical truth and mobilizes support through highly emotional, belief-based appeals and digital grievances.
Because, look, democratic collapse rarely happens overnight. It follows a pretty specific sequence. It starts with economic alienation, morphs into insularity, and breathes the fatal attraction of a strong man. But step 4 is the real kicker here. It relies heavily on the complicity of opportunistic enablers. These are moderate elites, business leaders, or establishment politicians who mistakenly believe they can somehow control or tame rising populist movements just to secure short-term gains, like deregulation or tax cuts.
We're also seeing some pretty striking parallels to the late Roman Republic. Rome didn't fall to sudden conquest. It unraveled from within due to bitter factionalism and the breakdown of unwritten customs, what they called the mos maiorum. When mutual toleration evaporated, politics devolved into a vicious zero-sum struggle, leading straight to the normalization of political violence. Today, the U.S. is experiencing a very similar stress on constitutional norms and an expansion of unchecked executive authority. And the data completely backs up this fractured reality when it comes to violence. The Public Religion Research Institute shows deep partisan divides regarding the actual drivers of domestic instability. For instance, 76% of Democrats believe public displays of hate symbols drive violence, compared to 51% of Republicans. We've reached a point where factions literally cannot even agree on the basic causes of the violence threatening the republic, let alone how to actually solve it.
Finally, let's look at part 5, the hegemonic inflection point. A hegemon's power relies almost entirely on its ability to set the rules of the international system and maintain what's called consented followership abroad. But the U.S. is increasingly struggling to maintain this status quo. We're seeing the erosion of historical alliances, a stark inability to dictate terms on the periphery. Just look at the widespread international resistance regarding conflicts like Ukraine and Gaza, and the steepest global decline in soft power and moral authority of any nation. And waiting right in the wings is the usurpation of this power by a rising rival China, actively expanding its diplomatic and economic footprint.
When you actually run the numbers and apply quantitative modeling to the life cycles of 29 historical great powers, a really startling projection emerges. From the unipolarity of the 1990s through our recent democratic downgrades, the models project that American primacy will reach a critical structural inflection point between the years 2032 and 2067. Our timeline as the sole architect of the international order is mathematically narrowing. So, that brings us to the final and absolutely most crucial point of this briefing, the ultimate question for you, the policymaker. You are facing compounding institutional decay, massive structural debt, and a quantified shrinking timeline for hegemonic decline. History is watching. Will this era of systemic upheaval be the definitive end of American hegemony, or will you use this crisis as the urgent catalyst for structural renewal? The choice and the policy is entirely yours.